In 169 AD, the most powerful man alive sat alone in a military tent on the frozen banks of the Danube and wrote in his private journal that he was disgusted with himself. Not his enemies, not his empire, himself. That man was Marcus Aurelius. He had everything: absolute power, philosophical training, a century of Roman wealth, and he was falling apart. What he wrote that night in a journal he never intended anyone to read changed how I think about failure, identity, and the one question nobody wants to ask themselves. The question is this: what do you do when the version of yourself you've been building your whole life turns out to be wrong? Not incomplete, not imperfect, wrong. That question is what Marcus Aurelius spent 12 years wrestling with on the frontier. And it's the question we're going to answer today. Most people think the Meditations is a philosophy book. It isn't. It's a crisis document, a man talking himself back from the edge. Written not for posterity, Marcus explicitly said he wrote it for himself. He called it ta eis hiauton, things to oneself. It was never meant to be published. Which means when you read it, you are reading something almost no historical document allows. The unfiltered interior of a person under enormous pressure, trying not to collapse. That's different from reading philosophy. That's reading a mind in real time. And the mind you're reading is one that was losing. Between 161 and 180 AD, Marcus faced the Antonine Plague, which killed an estimated 5 million people across the empire. A devastating war on two simultaneous frontiers. The betrayal of his closest general, Avidius Cassius, who staged a coup. And the slow revelation that his son Commodus was becoming a catastrophe he couldn't stop. Every single one of his Stoic teachers, Epictetus, Rusticus, Apollonius, had prepared him for hardship. But they had prepared him for hardship he could endure, not for hardship he had caused, or hardship that came from inside his own bloodline. That distinction matters enormously, because most of us aren't brought low by external catastrophe. We are brought low by the quiet accumulation of choices we made when we thought we knew what we were doing. And the ancient Stoics had a name for the mechanism that causes this. They called it hamartia, missing the mark. Not sin, not evil, just a systematic error in perception. Modern neuroscience has a different name for the same thing. It's called the default mode network, the system of brain regions that activates when you are not focused on anything external. When you are daydreaming, planning, thinking about yourself. It's the neural architecture of self-narrative, and when it malfunctions, it does something specific. Psychologists call this rumination. The prefrontal cortex, and responsible for rational planning, begins simulating futures and rehearsing pasts, but it can't stop. It gets stuck on a question it can't resolve. Usually that question is, am I enough? Marcus Aurelius, writing 2,000 years before the discovery of the default mode network, described this exact phenomenon. He wrote, and this is paraphrased from the Greek, that the mind disturbs itself, that nothing external forces it to be troubled, only its own judgment. He wasn't describing philosophy, he was describing neuroscience. The Stoics understood instinctively what neuroscience has confirmed, that suffering is almost never about what happens to you. It is about the story you tell yourself about what happens to you. And here is the brutal part. The story is almost always written in the first 5 minutes. Before you have all the facts, before you've had time to think. Your brain, specifically the amygdala, assigns emotional weight to events before your rational mind has even processed them. This is called affective forecasting bias. You feel certain you know how bad this is. You are almost always wrong. Marcus knew this. He called it fantasia, the initial impression. And he said, never trust the first impression. Always interrogate it. You have power over your mind, not outside events. That line is attributed to Marcus, though it's a paraphrase. But the original is sharper. He wrote that the obstacle to action advances action, that what blocks you becomes the path. Most people read that as motivational. It isn't. It's diagnostic. He was describing a cognitive reframe, one that modern cognitive behavioral therapy calls cognitive restructuring. Here's the part that nobody talks about. Marcus Aurelius, the greatest Stoic emperor, made choices that directly contradicted Stoic teaching. He named Commodus, his biological son, as his successor. Every advisor he had warned him against it. Commodus was erratic, narcissistic, and incompetent. The Stoic tradition was clear. The emperor should choose the best man, not the nearest one. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius. The era of the 5 good emperors was built on adopted succession. Marcus broke that chain. Why? Behavioral psychologists would call it legacy bias, the cognitive distortion where we overvalue continuity with our own identity, our own blood, our own story. We would rather leave a flawed version of ourselves than a perfect stranger. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, called Commodus the first wound inflicted on the Roman Empire. That wound was dealt by a Stoic philosopher. This is not a gotcha. This is the most important lesson in the video. Marcus Aurelius was not a failed Stoic. He was a human being applying Stoic principles imperfectly, under conditions of extreme emotional complexity, with incomplete information. Just like you. The Stoics never promised immunity from error. They promised awareness of error. The goal was not to become a person who never falls. It was to become a person who can observe their own falling and correct. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." But the deeper teaching, the one he buried in Book 3 of his Discourses, is this: even your reaction is not fully under your control. What is under your control is the practice of continuously returning to reason, not one moment of enlightenment. A practice, a daily return, like a compass that keeps getting knocked off course and keeps finding north. That's not inspiration. That's a technology. And it works for the same reason exposure therapy works, the same reason behavioral activation works in depression treatment, because the brain is plastic. It changes in the direction you consistently point it. Now I want to tell you about a man most people have never heard of. His name was James Stockdale. He was a United States Navy Vice Admiral, a combat pilot, and for 7 years, from 1965 to 1973, he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. The Hanoi Hilton. Before he was shot down, Stockdale had been reading Epictetus. Not casually, seriously. He had carried the Enchiridion, Epictetus's handbook, on the plane with him on the day of his last mission. When his plane was hit, and he ejected into enemy territory, he said to himself, "I'm leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus." 7 years, tortured repeatedly, kept in isolation, his leg broken and reset incorrectly, leaving him with a permanent limp. And he ran the prisoner resistance operation from inside the camp. He developed a covert communication system, tapping on cell walls, that allowed hundreds of prisoners to maintain human connection and organized defiance. When he was released and returned home, a journalist asked him who didn't make it out. He said, "The optimists." The journalist was confused. Stockdale explained, "The men who broke were the ones who kept setting deadlines. We'll be out by Christmas." Christmas came. "We'll be out by Easter." Easter came. Each broken expectation shattered something. "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end," Stockdale said, "with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." Jim Collins later called this the Stockdale paradox. But it is not a paradox. It is ancient Stoic epistemology. Confront what is real. Do not construct what is comfortable. The difference between Stoicism and toxic positivity is not one of degree, it is structural. Toxic positivity says, believe hard enough, and reality will bend. Stoicism says, face reality precisely, and your response can be unbreakable. One is a prayer, the other is a discipline. So what does this mean for the person watching this video right now? Here is what I think is happening. You are not struggling because you are weak. You are struggling because you have been handed a philosophy of resilience without the underlying architecture. Inspiration without structure, quotes without practice. The Stoics had a daily practice. It was not passive. Marcus Aurelius woke each morning and performed what he called prosoche, an examination of the day ahead. What obstacles might arise? How should he respond? What does virtue demand here? Before the day happened, he had already rehearsed it. Neuroscientists call this mental contrasting. The research of Gabriele Oettingen at NYU shows that visualizing the obstacles between you and your goal, rather than only the goal itself, produces significantly better outcomes than pure positive visualization. The Stoics invented mental contrasting 2,000 years before the studies, and Seneca added a companion practice, Praemeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Every evening, contemplate what could be lost: your health, your relationships, your work, not to become anxious, but to prevent the shock of loss from destroying your capacity to act. Grief becomes manageable when it has been anticipated. This is not morbid. It is neuroscience. The anticipation of loss reduces the amygdala's threat response when the loss occurs. You have, in psychological terms, already begun the work of adaptation. What blindsides you devastates you. What you have already faced, even in imagination, you can survive. Back to Marcus Aurelius on the Danube. That journal entry, the one where he expressed disgust at himself, was not a confession of defeat. It was, in Stoic terms, an act of epoch, suspension of judgment, followed by clear-eyed assessment. He looked at himself. He did not look away. He wrote it down, and then he kept going. He finished the campaign. He returned to Rome. He continued training Commodus, knowing it was probably futile. He did not pretend it was not futile. He acted anyway. The Stoics called this kathekon, the appropriate action, not the perfect action, not the guaranteed action, the right one, given what you know, with what you have. He died in 180 AD on campaign, not in Rome, not surrounded by luxury. He died in the field, among his soldiers still working. Cassius Dio, the historian, recorded that his final words to his officers were to look to themselves rather than to mourn him, because he was already going on ahead. He was 60 years old. He had been emperor for 19 years. He had never stopped practicing. There is a version of this story that ends with a lesson, a takeaway, 5 actionable steps. I'm not going to give you that, because the lesson of Marcus Aurelius is not a technique. It is a posture. It is the choice, made every single morning, to look clearly at what is real, to act on what is within your power, and to release what is not. The man who burned his own life down was not Marcus Aurelius. It was Commodus. It was every person who was handed a magnificent inheritance of wealth, or health, or time, or relationship, and refused to examine it clearly until it was already gone. Marcus didn't burn his life down. He built it imperfectly every day until the last one. The question Marcus Aurelius asked himself in that tent on the Danube, the question that launched 12 years of the most important philosophical writing in human history, was not, how do I become better? It was simpler than that, and harder. Am I actually doing what I believe? That's the question. Not whether you've read the right books, not whether you know the theory. Are you actually doing what you believe, today, in the small decisions, under pressure, when no one is watching? That's all Stoicism ever was. A daily confrontation with that question. You can start now.